Audubon, Barolo and Boyd shearwaters. So this was across the Caribbean and Micronesian regions. From the geolocated data, they define the annual schedules of each of the 7 colonies. So this is the arrival and departure dates and durations of migrations. They also identified foraging areas for the breeding and non-breeding periods, looked at the spatio-temporal distributions in the marine habitats they use, as well as at-sea activity patterns. So you can see that they've got a lot of data here. And they also collected standard morphometric measurements when they deployed the tags. So I'm going to give a really quick summary of some of their main results. They found that all three taxa to perform short distance migrations. So this was consistent with the morphological measurements. So they've got really short wings. And they found that they also segregate clearly spatially during the non-breeding period. They had specific foraging grounds for colonies of different taxa, but also for some colonies within the same taxon. So for Boyd shearwaters, for example, the 2 survey colonies shared common breeding and non-breeding areas, whereas the breeding and non-breeding habitats were partially or completely segregated between colonies with Barolo and Audubon shearwaters. They also found taxa to have differing body sizes, with Audubons being heavier and larger, suggesting a certain degree of specialization and environmental preferences while foraging. Habitat specializations identified from the habitat models, together with segregation of non-breeding areas, could be the result of divergent ecological adaptations of each colony to specific prey. But because the non-breeding distribution models didn't predict the breeding distribution for each taxon, it was concluded the little shearwaters are able to behave plastically year-round and can adapt to different marine habitats. And then finally, they found the 3 taxa to share similar phenologies and at-sea behaviours. While some of these results suggested the existence of 3 distinct evolutionary significant units, such as the spatio-temporal segregation, others, such as similar phenologies, foraging habitats, and specializations, suggest a recent evolutionary divergence of the 3 taxa. So yeah, this really great paper, which I think it was 5 different teams all collaborated on this. So it must have been really challenging pulling together all the different tracking data sets from all the different people. This actually brings me to my first question. So with the tracking data spanning an 8-year period, so not necessarily all of the colonies were being tracked at the same years, do you know if there are any yearly distribution differences, mainly for the non-breeding period? So might there be areas of overlap used under different environmental conditions? Like you have the small overlap you recorded between Boyds and Audubons in July to September.
Raul, you're unmuted, so you can go ahead.
Okay. If I understood well, so is the question is dealing with annual. So if there are changes across years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So as far as we tested for the longer data set that we have, which was for the Boyd shearwater from Cabo Verde, there were no differences, and the non-breeding sites were quite constant for all the individuals along the years. So as far as we know, and according to the data that we have at that moment, there were no changes at all.
Cool, okay. And then that also kind of leads on to my next question a little bit. I was wondering if you know of any tracking data, or if you plan to collect any more from any of the other little shearwater colonies. I know in one of the figures that you have points of unsampled colonies, such as one of the Audubon shearwater colonies off Brazil. Do you think that with this colony being quite close to the non-breeding area of the Boyd shearwaters, that certain populations might act as points of secondary contact between the taxa and might allow gene flow between populations?
So as far as we know, there are no other teams. Well, as far as I know, there are no other teams planning the tracking of other colonies. But maybe people from the audience can help me here. As far as I know, there are no other data available. There is no other data available or coming soon.
Cool. So do you think, like from the results that you saw, that distance was an important factor in terms of the UD overlap? Do you think that the populations that are closer together, then there might be some like more overlap than what you observed from the colonies that you sampled?
So, so the conclusions of our study was that, or the conclusion, the main conclusion was that the distance between the colony was not an important factor. So I wouldn't say that the closest the colony are the closest genetically, or the gene flu. There is more gene flu between the two. I have to confess that, so as you know, if you read the conclusion, so the study does not conclude anything in a robust way at the end. I'm not sure if I'm responding you properly. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And then just finally, before I let everyone else ask some questions, do you have any plans for tracking juveniles or pre-breeders? Because obviously these can make up a really large proportion of seabird populations. Yeah, do you have any idea where these individuals might go, and might that facilitate gene flow between the taxa?
That's a very interesting question, but but the answer from my side is no. So we have no plans at the moment to track these juvenile populations, and in fact, according to our experience, it's already quite hard to track the adult population. So the recovery rate is relatively low compared with other seabirds, and might be more challenging for the juvenile population. So at the moment, there is no plan in doing this. No.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
How many birds are tracked at one time? How many geolocators do you have on at one time?
You mean in one season?
Yes.
I don't remember, but the date, the numbers, the raw numbers, I think more or less for the season, maybe Jacob can help me, it's about 20 or something like this per season and colony, something like this.
Yeah, something similar to this, maybe a bit lower, about between 10 and 15. The thing is that this species is a strong diver, and we have the feeling that they are more sensitive to instruments in general. So at the beginning, perhaps at the beginning, we deployed about 20, but we decided to decrease these numbers because we had the feeling that, as Raul mentioned, recovery rates were relatively lower compared to other species. We also know that it's a species that it's also more sensitive to handling in general, compared, for example, to calonectary shearwaters, to cori shearwaters, which are quite somehow versatile. So we decided to low down these numbers, so in a way that we keep tracking them, some every year, like a dozen, but not to increase these numbers really, because of this impact, because we feel that it can have substantial impact. So we prefer to keep the numbers just low.
Cool. Thanks for that question, Joanna. David, do you have any comments or questions for Raul?
Yeah, Raul, first of all, congratulations on the really massive study, 20 pages, beautiful illustrations. I really enjoyed reading it. Well done. And it just struck me how wide they range in the Atlantic, and if you compare with the similar recent study led by Austin on the Yelkwa and Balearic shearwaters in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, it seems that for the Yelkwa and the Balearics, things are much more constrained, and for the complex you studied now, the birds overall range much more widely. So you may say, well, okay, they have the whole of the Atlantic as a playground in comparison to the tiny Mediterranean, but knowing the traveling capacities of these species, it doesn't really apply. So what's your feeling about these sort of differences?
You mean about the Puffinus clade? So
yes.
how?
Yeah, well, if you compare the overall home range of Balearic shearwaters, for instance, with the range you found now for the whole complex,
Yeah.
it's much more constrained. So I was wondering whether you had any clues what could drive such differences.
I don't know. It might be a matter of size, and related to this, a matter of the diet. So related with the size of the species, the diet they get, but also the size of. I'm just thinking, the size of the individuals, the size of each taxon, may allow. Migrate or move longer,
because
know.
I have this feeling that Gibraltar and the Mediterranean being more enclosed isn't really a barrier to oceanic seabird, is it?
No,
it's actually not a big deal for them to overflow into the Atlantic.
Yeah, definitely.
Of course, if we look at the map, we have this perception that things are more constrained in the Mediterranean, but seabirds don't really care about it. So that's why, I was wondering why there was such a big difference. But I understand that it's really hard to tell out of the blue.
It is. And the thing, and one thing that we should keep working on is, for instance, in the diet, so the prey that they are looking for in this migration. So, for instance, what they eat during winter, during the non-breeding season, it's something that might matter while understanding the migration of these birds. Because in fact, we compare the migrations of the 3 taxon in this manuscript. But at the end, so if you see the environmental modeling that we ran, it was a complete mess. So it was a clearly negative result. So populations or taxa were doing very different things during the breeding, or the habitat was very different during the breeding than during the non-breeding season. And this might be related to the diet that they are focusing on. So they are targeting.
So that means that there are possibly clues to this distribution which we haven't quite identified yet. So they probably read the landscape in another way than we do with distribution models.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Regarding the differences in migration, I mean, in a general context, that we say that in the Atlantic, there is a clear relationship between the size of the shearwaters and the capacity for migrating long distances. So the little shearwaters, they are strong divers and not such a good flyers. So the migrations we can see here, some of them are true migrations, are clearly directional, like the ones of the Void shearwater, but they are still short, like up to 2,000 kilometers. And when we go to Yelkoa and Balearic, and particularly Manx shearwater, we start to have like really long migrations, even when they are not really great gliders. So particularly Manx shearwater, for example, they fly from Northern Europe to the Patagonian shelf. So they are really long distance migrants. And then if you go to the larger species like great shearwaters, sooty shearwaters, or Cornish shearwaters, then we also can see very, very long migrating behavior, or long distance migration. So for me, it's clear that there is this typical compromise in seabirds that you are either a good diver or a good flyer, and somehow it's always a compromise between these two extremes. And within the shearwaters, you can somehow feel this compromise. Some species more closer to one end, and the others closer to the other end. That's my feeling.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It really makes sense. I'm handing over to Grant in case he has questions, and then to the rest of the audience. I
only have one sort of, and this might be, I realize this question is probably a complex one to answer, but I'm curious as to, you know, they obviously are showing similar day foraging behavior and similar phenology. So do you foresee there being similar responses to stressors? So for example, if you have a series of oceanic regime changes that are similar in say some of these foraging areas, would you expect the species to react the same, either their populations decreasing or phenology changing? So could you potentially use one of the species as an analog for the other to predict change?
According to the results that we see, I would say so. So because what our findings, so the findings just show that I would say taxa. So the different taxa behave, for instance, very similarly according to the at-sea behavior. So, for instance, and but also the phenology was quite close among the three taxa. So I would say that yes, changes could be expected similar between the different populations. Yeah, I would say so.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, and with that, I'll open it up to questions from the audience in case anybody has any. I don't see any hands raised at the moment, but if there's nobody waving at me frantically on the screen either. So, yeah, Raul, you're getting lucky so far. Nobody's dying to throw difficult questions at you.
And well, in the meantime, I've got another one. So at the end of the day, and after completing this really massive study, what's your feeling on the relative merits of conventional genetics and the more ecological approach you're taking? Is it complementary, or do you have the feeling that sometimes genetics throw out signals which don't really reflect ecological characteristics?
That's a very good question, and my feeling is that according to the preliminary results that some colleague of us are doing on this taxa, so taxa might be very different. So the genetic differences will appear and are quite obvious. But according to the ecology of the three taxa, I would say that they behave quite similar, and if they behave quite similar, that's true that in this particular case, the Audubon shearwater, it's much larger. This also adds something into this discussion. But so if the differences are only based on the genetic trees, so I don't know how to explain this, but I think that while defining a species properly, the ecology of the species should be noted, should be accounted for, and this is somehow how our study would like to contribute here. At the end, we were not very lucky, or at least our results are not very conclusive in this way, because at the end, the ecology of the three species were very similar at the end. But so we would like to stress in the study the importance of these ecological inputs to complement the genetics, of course.
And was there a particular conservation context to initiating this study? How did you come up with the idea of combining these different data sets?
So the idea just jump while organizing the International Albatross Petrel Conference, the 6th International Albatross and Petrels Conference in Barcelona. And at that point, I think I met with Vitor Paiva, Vincent Bretagnola, and Jacob. And the idea just came during that meeting, and we agree there in Barcelona to share the data sets and put all these together. So it was not a matter of conservation at the beginning of the first idea was not on the conservation, but more on the ecology. So understanding how these close taxa, so if they behave similar or differently. That was, and also, of course, if they share similar habitats, so if they overlap in the distribution during summer and winter or not. So this was the first ideas.
And am I right in thinking that the conservation status of the populations in the western part of the study system is much more shaky than in the east? So like the populations in the Caribbean, are they more under threat than on this side of the world?
I don't know, because some of the colonies there are quite large.
Okay.
But that's true that, so I'm not familiar with the area. I think that there are so many islands and islets in the Caribbean that are difficult to track. And maybe there are smaller colonies, but spread along a huge, vast area, whether in the eastern part, it's more focused in, well, not small, but large archipelagos, but just a few archipelagos, while in the Caribbean, it's more different and many.
And more redundancy in the choice of breeding sites.
But I'm not 100% sure, so this is just my guessing.
May I go back to one of your questions, David, that I think it's very, very interesting. I think that these ecological studies are really of great value in defining somehow the similarities between different taxa. That cannot be sometimes cannot maybe cope with genetic analysis. So somehow for having genetic differentiation, you need a lot of time. So you need really evolutionary time. But some ecological traits can somehow develop, some ecological differences can somehow develop much faster. And you can detect them straight away, even when you don't detect any genetic difference yet, because you still need perhaps thousands of years to develop. So somehow in this sense, I think they are complementary, and we currently tend to kind of ignore the value of the ecology and end up always saying, well, we need genetic analysis to actually have a clear answer about this. But I don't see it much in that way. I mean, the speciation process is something that it's in a slow process, and it's a step by step. I think one of the first steps that you can find in this speciation process between two closely related species is actually ecological differences. Later on, you will find the genetic differences. But the first thing that will appear will be some ecological differences. Somehow catching up a picture of this moment, it's already telling you about the divergence between populations and possibly speciation process. So in this sense, it's really adding a huge value to evaluating this process and also the status of the species. That's my
but from a legal point of view, when defining species and their conservation status. Of course, people will want clear-cut things, and they'll argue that, you know, behavior can shift, as you said, much faster than genetics. But the interesting point is now the accumulation of studies which shows how repeatable migratory and foraging behavior can be, and home ranges across at least populations and subpopulations. So I agree that it's a strong contribution.
It's quite an interesting point, actually. I mean, I'm not familiar with any work that's done it, but and maybe you guys are. But you know, is there anything like an ecological difference index that exists where you can accumulate a lot of this information into some sort of way of quantifying the differences, at least in a way that would be simplistic for, you know, non-scientists or managers?
I don't think there is such a fixed limit, but again, I'm not sure. I'm not very familiar with these taxonomic limits, I would say, from the genetic part.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there is a strict limit that when you so you jump through this limit, you can consider different species.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something relative at the end, and it needs agreement among the different researchers, I would say.
I feel like sometimes getting taxonomists to agree on something is probably more difficult than pulling teeth out of a chicken. I don't see any questions from the audience, so I think it's 14:35.
There is one.
Oh, do we have one? Who's Oh, sorry, I didn't see you waving at me there. Hang on a second. There you go, Mary Claire. You're on.
It wasn't quite a question. It was just that I recall, like, from the non-seabird world, that there was a splitting, at least of management units, of an oriole in very sketchy memory. I think the Philippines, and that was on the basis of a callback experiment. So that just being able to show that a particular population did not respond to the calls of another population really helped to, like, split them into different management units, and therefore aid the conservation of one particular population that was doing worse off. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not a consensus, of course, but it seems like, yeah, if you can show, like, yeah, this is functioning as a different population, I mean, it makes all the sense, because, as we're saying, species is a man-made construct, and what's important is then how viable a group of individuals are.
Yeah. I mean, you do see that a lot in the songbird world, right? I mean, you get these subpopulations that get split by the call. I mean, you look at song sparrow, for example, in North America. Song sparrow, you know, were the same species for a long time, but when you look at the call variation across the gradient, it's huge. The difference between like an Aleutian song sparrow versus, say, a northeastern song sparrow is absolutely stunning. And you can not only can you visualize it, but you can hear it, especially for the people who are keen birders. But then you get these other kind of funny ones, like Leach's storm petrel, for example. Whereas there seems to be some genetic evidence to suggest that the Atlantic and Pacific populations are diverging, but the calls are identical. And when you try to quantify them, you can't tell them apart very well. The differences are so minute. So anyways, yeah, that's an interesting discussion point there. And I think with that, actually, I think we should probably move on to the next paper before we get caught down a rabbit hole. So thanks for that, Mary Claire. There are some comments down in the group chat, so please feel free to continue the discussion down there. Kirsty, thanks for introducing that paper. Raul, congratulations on a really cool paper, and that's obviously a pile of work that you guys have put into it. Jacob, thank you for joining us and commenting. It's great to see you. Yeah, please continue to sit on the line while we move on to the next paper, who will be introduced by David. And with that, I will unmute Jared, and I think Nicholas is with us too. Or maybe he isn't. I'm not seeing him on my screen at the moment. Oh, wait, I'm seeing a waving hand. There you go, I got you. Hi, Nicholas. Hi, Jared. Nice to see you.
Hi, Grant. How's it going?
Yeah, doing really well. Glad you could join us today. David, I think I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, and I'm glad the two authors could join. So the oceans are still full of surprises, and that makes our job so exciting. And I think we've got a good example today with the study led by Jared Towers from Bay Cytology in Alert Bay, British Columbia, and Nicolas Gasco from the National Natural History Museum in Paris. And they published this note on giant petrels snatching bits of live sperm whales at sea. So how do they do this, and why? So there's this thing called Patagonian longline fisheries in the Southern Ocean. And this fishery attracts killer whales and sperm whales, which like to take the fish from the line underwater. And with the increasing sperm whale population, I was told that now the worldwide sperm whale population eats as much food as all of the seabirds. Maybe the authors can infirm or confirm this saying. Because of increasing sperm whale populations, there are lots of them around toothfish longliners. They spend a lot of time around the vessels. And this is a new feeding opportunity for giant petrels. And especially male northern giant petrels are known to feed on marine mammals. So they're used to this. And because the sperm whales dive deep and for long periods when depredating the long lines, the authors think that they may want to rest a lot near the sea surface in between dives. This is when the giant petrels land on their backs and take a bite. That must hurt a lot because these interactions are usually short, although some whales do not react, but most of the whales react by diving, rolling sideways, or staying just below the sea surface, a behavior the authors describe as snorkeling. So the authors observed 23 such events for fishing vessels of South Georgia, the Crozet and Kerguelen Islands, with the first observation sometimes in the late 90s, and most events spotted in recent years. So this is a new type of seabird marine mammal interaction facilitated by fisheries. But actually there's also a recorded case of kelp gulls preying on the skin of southern right whales of South America. So I found this really cool and a nice example of natural history at its best. But looking at the pictures, and there are really nice pictures of one sequence in the paper, I was wondering, are you absolutely sure that this is the giant petrel taking a bit of the skin of the sperm whale and not trying to remove a parasite, has been shown, for instance, in seabirds at the surface of basking sunfish?
Yeah, thanks, David. I can jump in here, and nice to see you and Nico and a few other familiar faces. That's a great question, and I think it's one of the first questions that I had when I saw this. That there's no evidence of any parasites on the skin of sperm whales at such latitudes, and even when we were photographing sperm whales or tagging them, which you need to be in quite close proximity to the animal to do that kind of thing, there's no evidence of any kind of commensal or parasite on their bodies. They do sometimes slough their skin, so there's patches of skin that are a bit rough and probably falling off naturally. But other than that, we couldn't see anything on their bodies. They don't have barnacles, for example, like some other whales do. And, panella, we didn't see any evidence of panella on their bodies at all.
And you could see them, the point is that you could see them react in a way that in most cases you thought this was pretty uncomfortable and painful for the whale.
Yeah, I think they were pretty surprised when it first happened, and then expecting it to happen more often after that first attack. And you could see this behavior develop over the course of a predation bout, where a giant petrel would attack a sperm whale first, and then on subsequent attempts to attack the whale, the sperm whale would either roll or just sink or snorkel, you know, where it would.
Do you, yeah, and do you have a guess of what the giant petrel is actually taking? Because my knowledge of giant petrels is more land-based, and I've only seen them feeding on things which were nearly dead or already dead, where they have enough time to work on the carcass. But I imagine the skin of the sperm whale being pretty tough. So what's your feeling on how this could work?
You know, I thought sperm whale skin would be pretty tough as well. I've done a necropsy on a dead sperm whale before, and the skin was thick and really leathery. But you know, when those animals are live and in the water, the skin's wet, and it's pretty similar to other cetacean skin. You know, I've biopsied a number of cetaceans, and you know, those darts just go in and pop right out again, no problem. Sperm whales are no different. And you know, it seemed to me like these giant petrels, they only have a brief opportunity to get something from the sperm whales. And that's another reason why we kind of thought that they weren't taking any kind of parasite or commensal off the bodies of sperm whales, because, you know, it's so windy and so rough down in the subantarctic seas that the giant petrels would come in and it's almost like they would just attack whatever part of the body they could get access to for that brief period of time that it was exposed at the surface. And it just seemed like I don't know if you could see there's some images in the paper there of the giant petrels flying down, and before they hit the whale, their mouth is already open, and they're just going in to gouge whatever skin and flesh they can before the sperm whale dives or the next wave rolls over it, and they fly off anywhere from 1 to 3 seconds later.
Yeah, and it's also a good way to test, just in case that whale might be dying or not so fit, and maybe a way for the giant petrel to capitalize and come back to that animal if it's really in trouble at some stage, and then get a lot of food.
Perhaps, yeah. You know, I think in calm seas, the sperm whales will rest on the surface during the period between their deep dives. And, you know, maybe these sperm whales could attempt such a thing if they weren't getting attacked by giant petrels and if it wasn't so rough. But yeah, certainly in calm seas, you do see sperm whales just laying at the surface for several minutes at a time as they replenish their oxygen stores before going on their next foraging dive.
Yeah, and when the sperm whales are in more tropical waters, there's no evidence that then they might be attacked by larids, as for instance the southern right whales by kelp girls.
That's a great question. You know, once this paper was published, it was someone posted on Facebook, and it kind of started making the rounds. And a colleague of mine from the Azores, Lisa Steiner, who studies sperm whales there, sent me a few photographs. Well, she posted a few photographs actually of terns landing on sperm whales. And she's seen this behavior a couple times. And on one occasion, she saw the sperm whale react to this tern landing on its back. And on the other occasion, the tern actually just stood there, and the sperm whale didn't react to it at all. So she feels that the reaction of the sperm whale on that one occasion was because the tern actually pecked its skin, or you know, it disturbed it in some way. And she's got photos of the sperm whale flicking its tail up and diving, and the tern flying away. So that's the closest I know of. And I do know terns tend to land on things in the ocean. I had one land on my head one day while I was standing in a boat trying to photo ID a minke whale, and it stayed there for 11 minutes as I just walked around the boat. So they do land on things that are kind of floating in their environment. So, but as for gulls or other species of petrel pecking at sperm whales in the tropics, I've never heard of anything else other than that tern in the Azores.
And the very first observation reported in the paper from around 97, did you do that observation, or who was it actually?
Well, no, that was Nico.
Okay.
Perhaps he could, yeah, jump
Tell
in.
us about that first. Tell us about that first observation.
It was striking. I saw the giant petrels on the whales reacted very strongly. Must have heard. I kept this in my mind until Jared saw some more, and we got in touch.
And that observation, where was it?
I think it was Kerguelen.
Okay, of Kerguelen.
Yeah.
And then we asked all observers at sea if they observed this already, and some of them did, and even I told them to have a look more carefully, and one of the guys saw and took good pictures the next day.
Okay.
Is this something that you would expect to see in foraging aggregations outside of the fisheries? I mean, the paper sort of suggests that this might be something that's associated only with fishing. And in fact, I mean, at my time in sea, I don't think I've ever come across, and I've seen a number of sperm whale in places like Alaska, but part of natural foraging aggregations. But I don't think I've ever recalled seeing birds sitting on or pecking at whales in those kind of aggregations. So do you reckon this is just a fisheries interaction?
Yeah, that's a great question, Grant. One of the reviewers of the paper, asked the same question, and it's a good point. I think that, under natural circumstances, perhaps along the shelf edge, in areas of really high production, you might get, loose aggregations of sperm whales, and, in those areas, there's a lot of seabird activity. But the unusual thing with Patagonian toothfish long-lining operations, in my experience, is that, there are these massive feeding opportunities that are like highly localized. And so you get all this wildlife kind of flocking towards the boat. So some days, I observed up to 14 sperm whales around the boat at one time. And, some of those were under the water, while others were on the surface, and vice versa. But it kind of goes to show of the size of the aggregation. So whether or not it happens naturally or ever did, I'd imagine it probably does from time to time, but there wouldn't be much opportunity, I think, for a bird to repeat the behavior over the course of its life, other than in just remote and rare circumstances. That's just my own impression, though. I mean, maybe it does happen more often than we know, but at least because, Nico, myself, and other observers were situated on Patagonian toothfish longliners, we were just seeing it repeatedly once we started recognizing that this was quite unusual, and that given that those are the only massive aggregations of giant petrels and sperm whales that we're aware of, in those areas, that it's probably perpetuated and sustained at least by that industry, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that's quite cool. I got to say, though, that being said, I'm almost not surprised when I saw your paper come out. I was almost not surprised that this behavior was recorded. I mean, I think that giant petrels have got to be like some of the most vicious animals in the marine world. Anyways, don't
say this to Jacob. I think Jacob will be about to explode in a second.
I mean it in the best of ways. I've got to my career in seabirds would have taken a very different turn had it not been for a very angry southern giant petrel down at Turret Point on King George Island. But I have one of my last experiences with seabirds in New Zealand. It was actually just before I moved away. There was a big thing they do at the end of when the Hut and shearwaters are fledging, where they get the injured birds after they've hit lights and stuff like that, and they release them on the tourist boats. And I happened to be on a boat with Graham Taylor from New Zealand, from Department of Conservation at the time, and he had this injured bird, his injured Hut and shearwater, and its neck was, it was clearly not a bird that was going to survive. but he released it into the water with all these tourists watching. And it was this lovely little moment. This bird landed on the water, was kind of spinning in circles. And out of nowhere, this giant petrel comes in, and grabs the bird and flew off. And the looks in the tourists' faces were just absolutely shocked. this total visceral experience, it was wild. So yeah,
they're the ultimate opportunist. I didn't recognize that until seeing this behavior of them feeding on sperm whales, and it was mind-blowing, really. I mean, I knew
did you have the feeling that they were targeting specific areas?
No, I think that we observed mostly that they were, or at least photographed mostly that they were targeting the top of the head and the top of the back between the blowhole and the dorsal fin. But again, that's a part of the whale that is usually at the surface. So, sometimes they'd be closer to the dorsal fin and sometimes they'd be closer to the top of the head. Sometimes they'd approach from the side. They'd land in front of a sperm whale and then wait for it to approach. Sometimes the sperm whale would actually turn a little bit, and then the image sequences from some of the photos show that the giant petrels would then swim up to the side of the sperm whale and try to peck it, or jump up onto its back and then peck it from there. But there's other photos. You can see they're more distant, mind you, but you can see the giant petrels flying above a sperm whale that's at the surface and attempting to approach it just as it's arching, almost like a last ditch effort before the sperm whale goes down for several minutes to try and get a mouthful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This must be like kind of just a minor annoyance to these things. Is there any indication that this is happening at a large enough scale that it's going to impact the behavior of sperm whales, or have any sort of real negative impact on them other than just kind of pissing them off?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. I would relate it to us getting bitten by a horsefly, or any kind of larger marine mammal getting bitten by a cookie cutter shark or something like this. But,
yeah.
I don't know. Like, Nico, did you get any idea of whether or not this is happening often enough at Crozet or Kerguelen to impact things?
It's hard to say. We didn't see much in 20 or something years. We've started to observe that. It's not very often, but difficult to say if all the giant petrels start to observe and repeat the same behavior some stage. I don't think so, but.
Yeah.
But in the southern right whale studies, you mentioned when they get attacked by kelp gulls in South America, this did have an incidence on space used by the whales and potentially on their health.
Yeah, it's a bit different there in the sense that these are really protected areas where the southern right whales go to. And so the water is quite calm. Even if it's windy, it's quite calm because it's happening often in bays. And so these kelp gulls, the water is also quite shallow too. So I think the birds can actually see the whales when they're not at the surface and can line up their attacks a bit better. So what happens there is the kelp gulls can pick away at existing wounds over days, hours, weeks. And and there is some indication.
Yeah, this must have an impact.
It does, yeah. It opens up the body to infectious disease, and it may be contributing to mass mortality events as well. So and the southern right whales are growing in their population size, but last I heard they were still at risk. That this isn't a species that was heavily whaled and hunted in the last century, so in the 1800s. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal for that population. The sperm whales and giant petrel situation, on the other hand, although very similar, I don't anticipate is going to be affecting the animals in the same way.
And the people working on the longliners, when you mentioned this to them, did they say, "Oh yeah, I've seen this 100 times already," or were they surprised?
Yeah, no, I did ask that because it struck me as odd when I first saw it, but yeah, I think it was something that they'd seen before, but they hadn't really paid much attention to. Just kind of oh yeah, there they are, doing that again. Yeah, I think it's for those who work on those boats. It's something that they probably observe quite frequently over the years.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Do we have any questions from the audience while we're here? I don't see any hands raised or anything like that at the moment.
Well, in any case, Jared and Nicola, I really and absolutely admire you for being able to get onto these vessels for long periods. I had to say this.
Thanks, David. I only spent a few weeks, 6-7 weeks on board one, but it was an amazing experience, and I really got to hand it to the folks who spend a lot more time out on those boats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's gonna be interesting to see what happens this year with COVID. A lot of the fisheries observers are not out there at the moment. We have a question from Jonathan Green. Jonathan, sorry, John. I just
yeah, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the paper, and the guys read it in our research group recently, though I missed most of that meeting. I think it's just a comment on what David said at the start. These jeeps are really adaptable birds. I saw one hunt down and kill a brown skewer chick on the same day that I saw a brown skewer hunt down and kill a giant petrel chick. And I've seen giant petrels take down penguin chicks both on land and in the water. That tends to be in groups. They are quite adaptable and impressive birds. So while it was super cool to read about this attacks on the whales, but they're perhaps smarter birds than we might initially have given them credit for. I won't use the phrase that British seamen used to call these birds, but maybe some of you are familiar with that.
Yeah. Do we have any,
Thanks, Jonathan.
Any other
and with respect to the last comment about the work or non-work of fisheries observers during the pandemic, Jared, do you have any feeling on the repercussions this may have for fishing operations, legal and illegal, in the Southern Ocean?
I think Nico may be better positioned to answer that.
Yeah, it's a very big deal at the moment, and there's a lot of discussions. Some of the boats have been, it was difficult to have 2 observers on board, but most of them had 1. And I think one Japanese board was wondering if he could go at sea with just national observers, because in Cameron waters you need to have an observer from another country, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to put the observers on the boat, and it's very big. It's a big issue to get the observers back home. Observers are stuck in countries all over the world trying to get back.
Mm.
Yeah, that's true. All right. I'm not seeing any particular questions here. It's 6 o'clock, so I guess, 6 o'clock my time, 6 o'clock here in the UK. So probably time to wrap things up. And Jared, Nico, thanks for joining us. It was quite cool. It's great to see these kind of papers still exist in the world. The natural history sort of stuff is kind of dwindling. I think we spend a lot of we keep forgetting to look at those sorts of things and publish these kind of interesting behaviors. So thanks for bringing that up and for joining us today. And David, of course, thank you as always. Kirsty, thank you for presenting your first paper and joining us today as our guest host. It was great to have you, and nice to see everyone's faces, of course.
Yeah, I've been missing the session across the last 2 weeks.
Yeah. So next week we're gonna just, instead of going to the early time slot next week, we are gonna just continue on and come back to the 1600 GMT time slot next week as if we would have normally. Thank you all for being understanding last week and allowing us to move everything to this week. So yeah, so we'll have a couple more papers next week. We'll have Sean G, who will be joining us as our guest host. He's going to be, he's in California, so he'll be joining us early in the morning, his time. And yeah, with that, thanks to the authors, thanks to everyone here for joining us. And yeah, stay inside, stay safe, wash your hands, don't get sick. It's nice to see you all. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.